Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about rhetorical strategies. At this point, you should have watched my rhetorical analysis lecture. And in it, I talk about for rhetorical analysis, the sort of point is to analyze a text, right? Analyze an argument and figure out how an author or speaker swayed an audience, right? Using specific writing strategies. So what tools in their writing toolkit did they draw on in order to try to reel the audience in? And today we're going to be talking about rhetorical strategies or writing strategies that you'll want to sort of keep in mind as you read iGen and think about the rhetorical tools that Twenge herself is using and how she's using them to kind of, again, hook her various audiences, right? And again, this information in this lecture slide will be available on Blackboard. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about and emphasize is that as writers, we make choices, right? We choose different types of strategies, different types of evidence, depending on our audience, right? To make it more persuasive. And you guys know this, right? The way you might convince a friend of something might be very different than the way that you go about convincing, a grandparent, right? If I'm having a discussion or a debate with my best friend, it looks very different than if I'm having that same discussion or talking about the same issue with my grandmother, right? So we sort of know this intuitively that as writers, we have to make choices in order to meet the demands of that particular audience, right? And so depending on audience, those strategies are going to change, right? One audience might really value personal testimony, while another audience might be all about the facts and hard evidence, right? So we need to know that. Now, thinking about Twenge, right? We know that she has a lot of different audiences. She's trying to write for iGeners, but she's also trying to write for fellow researchers, right? So when you're reading her book, you might think about that, where it's like, oh, I get why she's putting in all this hard evidence, but I also get why she's making jokes, right? So maybe the jokes and tone appeal to a younger audience who doesn't want just research upon research, but maybe those the hard evidence appeals to audiences that value the stats, the logic, the numbers, right? So to emphasize this, you probably recognize Kamala Harris here. And I want to look at two different speeches that she was making. And you'll start to, I hope you start noticing that she made some different choices, right? In the one here, we see her rocking the rainbow jacket, right? She's wearing Converse. She's very kind of loose. She's laughing. Her hair's up, right? Versus here, where notice how her dress changes, her hair changes, her just whole demeanor changes. This is, again, this is meant to emphasize that as writers and as speakers, we make choices with intention to appeal to different audiences. And with a rhetorical analysis paper, you want to be really aware of how those choices are working or not. So you might ask yourself with these two pictures, why might it work for in picture A for her to rock the Converse and to be a little bit more casual versus here to be a little bit more formal? You might just begin asking yourself what those choices mean, what they do. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to think about the big takeaway, and then I'll get into the actual list of strategies. The big idea is that writers use many types of strategies to make their work compelling, right? And the strategies writers choose will greatly depend on their purpose and audience. So when you're thinking about your rhetorical analysis of Twenge's iGen, you want to think about, okay, what strategies is she using, and how are these strategies working, right? Are they appealing to an audience that values research? Are they giving the tone of the book a more casual, inclusive, open feel? What are these choices actually doing? That is the point of a rhetorical analysis. Okay, so at this point, a laundry list of rhetorical strategies is coming. Most of them, some of them I'll define. There's many more than this. I just want you to begin thinking about all the different tools that writers can use. So they can use juxtaposition, which is a side-by-side placement, right? This is a juxtaposition, right? Notice I've placed these two images side by side to make a point. So often we'll see writers doing that, especially if you've ever watched an infomercial where it's like a before and after, right? Visuals, this is self-explanatory. We see Twenge using visuals via charts and graphs to emphasize points. Expert opinions can be used. Criteria, meaning the standards that a person is using to make a judgment, can be used. Someone's tone, right? What does it mean to have a humorous tone versus a very serious tone, or a formal tone versus an informal tone? Anecdotes, Twenge uses these all the time, right? These personal stories or little stories that she peppers in. You can think about, why would she do that, right? Why are stories so important? Repetition, there's my little joke, right? Writers use repetition with intention, right, to really emphasize points. Humor. A lot of you mentioned that Twenge used the joke about phones being like crack, right? That she's trying to weave in humor. Credentials. You'll notice that right on the side of the book, Twenge has the words PhD, has the letters PhD right after her name. You can think about how someone's credentials or expertise can be persuasive. Diction, just meaning word choice and language decisions. Right? Some of you didn't like some of the language decisions that Twenge made because you felt like she was being overly general, right? Statistics, I think we're pretty familiar with that. Personal examples, we notice that sometimes Twenge will put in a personal testimony from her own life, right? She'll talk about herself growing up as a Gen Xer. Emotional appeals. Analogies meaning ways in which things are similar. So cow is to milk, and you could think of a comparison, right? But anything that's analogous, meaning they share some sort of similar relationship. Graphs and charts. Twenge does this all the time, doesn't she? It's almost every other page she uses graphs and charts. You can think about why she's using those graphs and charts. Logical appeals. Even something as simple as punctuation can be used rhetorically, right? If it's just the same type of sentence over and over again, it can get rather boring. So even just the way punctuation could be a way that writers try to capture audience. Metaphors and similes, which are more in other figurative language, these are specific types of comparisons. Exemplification and examples, right? Twenge's constantly using examples which help to illustrate a point, right? Again, when Twenge, she not only uses this with the stories that she brings in as examples, but she'll also use examples of the claims that she's making, which I think you'll want to pay attention to. Ethical appeals, right? Syntax, right? The way in which just words and sentences are arranged, right? The organization of sentences can be appealing or not. Common sense. Again, Twenge does this a lot, where she'll kind of make a call to just our common sense. Rhetorical questions can be used. Descriptions and observations. Again, we see this throughout Twenge's book. Just defining terms. Notice Twenge defines what an iGener is. She says it's those folks born between 1995 and 2012. You can think about why that's important to define terms. That way readers aren't confused. That way readers have a clear sense of the generation, for example, that she's talking about. Research, we know this, right? So if Twenge just brought in claims and made claims, that wouldn't be persuasive. But you can think about how the research she incorporates begins to help make her arguments more compelling. Quotations, again, quotations, especially from experts. And so at this point, I'm going to pause. Again, there's more rhetorical strategies than this, but these are just some of the writing strategies that I want you to be aware of and identify as you're reading. This is the easy step, right? The harder step is explaining why and how these particular writing strategies worked in a context. Okay, so at this point I want to look at one example, right? And I found this image, and we can begin, and I'm going to ask you to identify some of the writing strategies or rhetorical strategies at work here. You can pause the video, see how many you can identify here. Okay, so let's take a look. Well, notice that this whole thing's a visual. Notice we get the side-by-side placement of these four igeners, the juxtaposition, right? Notice that we get a generation under the influence of a smartphone. So we notice we kind of get this metaphor folded in, the way in which they're using their diction, their word choice, to sort of make a comparison between smartphones and under the influence. We often think about alcohol, right, or drugs. Notice that there's a question here, a rhetorical question, can we harness the positive trends while mitigating the negative, right? So notice how the creator of this image used a blend of strategies in order to make a point. And you can think about what that point they were able to make. I would argue that ultimately through the use of visuals, as well as this question, the creator successfully helps viewers begin to think about igeners and some of the important trends that are emerging. Notice that could become almost a thesis statement, right, if I were doing a rhetorical analysis of this particular image. But the idea here is that kind of the first step of rhetorical analysis is just to be able to ID or identify rhetorical strategies at work. So at this point, I hope that you are able to now identify rhetorical strategies in the reading. And this is the easy work, just to be able to kind of log, Twingy's using a blend of graphs, research, tone, personal stories, anecdotes, etc., and just start logging that, because those are going to be the strategies that you want to then analyze and think about what they actually did for her argument when you get to the writing process for this essay. There'll be more, again, coming your way, and this video will be available, as well as the PowerPoint on Blackboard.